Great Minds on Learning is sponsored by the Learning Technologies Awards 2025.
When they announced the gold winner, we were, it's us. Wow.
It was really a very, very special moment.
It meant so much to win this award. It was a really proud moment for all of us.
The Learning Technologies Awards brings together the best in global learning technologies. It's a highly prestigious recognition of achievement and innovation.
Quality is very, very important, and learning technologies have got such an amazing reputation for quality.
They're really rigorous. They're not sort of just handed out. You really have to demonstrate that this course has made an impact.
Winning can change lives, build careers, and turbo boost learning in your organisation.
Winning the award has brought a lot of recognition to our team, and it's really validated a lot of things that we're doing for the group.
It is such lovely validation.
Basically, this confirmation that we're on the right track, that it makes impact, and that we're able to expand.
Apply today at learningtechnologiesawards.co.uk. Great Minds on Learning is supported by Talent Desk, one centralised place to onboard, manage and pay all your freelancers and vendors seamlessly and compliantly.
Oh no. No. With Talent Desk, you get seamless freelancer management, so you have time to make yourself that well-deserved cup of joe without losing your mind.
Visit talentdesk.io/greatminds and get 1 month free. Plus, more time for coffee.
Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to Great Minds on Learning. In this acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of learning theory, from the Greeks to the geeks. The digital computers of today have their origins in mechanical devices invented for rote mathematical calculation and record keeping. But right from the start, the 19th century innovators of early computing envisioned that the new technology could have uses far beyond these. Ultimately, they claimed, it might even become capable of a type of thought. In this episode, Donald and John explore the great minds, from Babbage and Lovelace to Turing, who set us on the course towards what has come to be known in our own era as artificial intelligence.
So, welcome back, everybody. Did you miss us? I'm sure you did. It feels like a long time since the last official season. I'm here with my regular co-host, the fantastically well-read, globe-trotting Donald Clark. Donald, do you want to tell us what you've been up to in all that 8 months?
All right, 8 months, right? My memory's failing me the older I get, but recalling a bit. So I've been traveling a lot, as you know, and giving these talks on AI. In fact, last time I saw you, I think, was in Berlin, where we did our...
Yep.
We did
a podcast. Very enjoyable.
That was nice. I've been in France, Scandinavia, all over the shop, really all over Europe, especially, and I'll be continuing that this year. I've been writing a book as well, so I got commissioned to write this book called AI and Productivity that turned out to be a big topic this year, because as we've moved from AI being a thing, amazing, weird, strange, into it actually being applied in the real world, and everybody's going, well, how does it actually optimize things in my organization? Give me some practical advice now. So I've been doing that for the last 6 months. Really. I'm well underway with that. That will be published this year. But as you know, John, because I know you've written about books, they take a fair bit of time in doing. So I've been doing all that. And then I got a tattoo.
Show us the tattoo for those on YouTube. Won't mean much to all you listening on audio.
No, but it is actually, I'll make sure I get a view of this. It is actually an ammonite. Can you see that okay?
Maybe a bit towards your left.
My left. That way?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, brilliant.
So right behind me up here on my shelves, the reason I got a tattoo, people puzzle always ask, well, why an ammonite? And that's because I've been collecting fossils since I was a boy. And here in Brighton, if you wander around the town, you see ammonites all the time in the buildings because of two architects called the Eamon Wilds. And so it signifies Brighton for me as well a little bit.
Yeah. The pubs I go to are full of fossils.
Yeah, exactly. Being one myself, of course. And then Amun, it comes from the god Amun. I go to Egypt, as you know, every year and love that Egyptology. So the origin of the words from Egypt. And I like the the spiral, I was in France this year in Lascaux, and I've been to Altamira, these old caves, about 40,000 years old, cave paintings. And the very first forms of abstract expression beyond representing, a bull or something on a wall was actually the spiral. You find it in Neolithic art, but you also find it much older in these ancient, 30, 40,000 year old cave paintings. The spiral is the first abstract thing that our species drew. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's so nice, and I really just love the shape. And there's a friend of mine who did it. He got the 3D ammonite quite nicely there.
Right.
So that was all good.
So this time we're digging down into the strata, through the layers, into the very earliest roots of computing, but also AI and online learning. There's a bit of a steampunk feel to this episode for me, partly because the stories and images of two of these theories, at least, Babbage and Lovelace, turn up so often in steampunk iconography, which is widespread on TikTok and Reels, as well as gaming, graphic novels, and cosplay events like Comic-Con. That's been going for a while. But also because it represents such a collision between the old and the new, between the very first computing machines, which are made from cogs and gears and punch cards and physical stuff. And that collides with the very up-to-the-moment virtuality of digital media nowadays, because we're looking here at the earliest roots of AI, along with the earliest roots of computing. Don't quite get that myself, so I'm agog to find out how you're going to stitch that all in.
All right.
These contemporary links will be very obvious in the case of the last and most recent of the theorists we cover, Alan Turing. His Turing test is referenced all the time in relation to chatbots, for instance, but he's going to need a bit more teasing out, perhaps, with some of the others.
Yeah.
We also can't forget that fascinating the story of computer tech is in itself. We're primarily here to talk about learning, and it's those links I'm especially interested to hear about. So to start us off, Donald, can you give us an introduction to this fascinating groups of theorists, mathematicians, engineers, geniuses, and weirdos that you have assembled for us this time?
Sure, yeah. Well, I got really interested in this group because, as some of our listeners will know, and you well know, we did an interesting podcast on the theorists behind artificial intelligence and so on when we did famous Hebbian learning, McCulloch and all those Rosenblatt, and all the modern guys like Geoffrey Hinton and of course Dennis Hassabis. So we did those, but they're sort of software people in a way, But of course, it's so often the case that we discuss theory but not practice. And of course, the things we actually are using here to do this podcast, and we all have one in our pocket or smartphones, are actually physical devices. Somebody had to build the stuff for this stuff to be delivered on. And indeed, it wasn't just a matter of delivery. The very concept of artificial intelligence or learning technology, full stop, needs hardware. And actually, the hardware itself now in AI is massive data centers, training sets, big data, and so on. So this group of people, in a sense, represent the physical manifestation of software and learning, because that, interestingly enough, it's the hardware that learns, the software that learns within the hardware at very least. So we're looking at a group that both envisioned what a computer would be, so they are theorists, very, very smart. Babbage, a genius mathematician, really. They envisaged what computers could do on learning themselves, but actually built them. I think this actually matters, in an age where we've discussed this before, but in an age where I saw the speaker Rory Sutherland recently say, we've educated everyone really just to win arguments and read text, and hardly anybody now gets trained or learns how to do things. And I know your kids are doing really great things, playing music, illustrators and so on, similar to my kids, you're in companies. And I think these people represent that side of the coin. So, and just to roughly run through these people here. So we're going to start with Babbage, because he really is the progenitor for all this and building the first real computer. Although he didn't build it, interestingly. His son built a version now. He didn't actually realize the build when he was alive. And then the famous Ada Lovelace, who conceptualizes on the back of this physical machine fascinating ideas around programming and software that learns. Then we move into Hollerith, an American who actually built this massive punch card basic thing for the American census. There's some really interesting and weird and dark sides to him as well. Mm-hmm. And then we come into Flowers, who built Colossus here in the UK at Bletchley Park, that helped win the war, helped beat fascism, as it were, which is a fantastic achievement. And he really wasn't recognized enough for this, I don't think. And then the wonderful Vannevar Bush, who set the scene in America for all of this. You have none of this stuff. You know, he was the guy behind the Manhattan Project, who just post-war got government, private enterprise, and academia all working together to give you Silicon Valley and all the amazing things that have emerged since. And then we end on that tragic genius, Turing. Mm. And so I think we've got a suite through here. We could have had lots of other people in here, but I think, you know, given the limitations of time, these are colossal figures in themselves. I just want to end on one thing here. That it's not as if this came out of the blue, you know. The notion of mechanical devices to do things that we do in our minds was around. So there's a very famous example, just because I like sort of archaeology in general, and that's the Antikythera mechanism, which is about 100 BC. Yeah. And they found that at the bottom of the ocean, just off of Greece. And that was the first known mechanical device that really calculated something. It was actually an astronomical device that was used to it had gears in it, and it would plan planetary motion and so on. And then you had things like very famous Scotsman, John Napier, Napier's Bones, but the slide rule I actually used at school. And that was invented in the early 1600s from the Napier logarithmic thing. So, and then Pascal's calculator, Leibniz, recognized that, I love his name, Gottlieb, Wilhelm Leibniz is a great favourite of mine because he's a philosopher. And then the big one that's really worth mentioning just before we go into Babbage, because he was really relevant, we could have done him in a lot of detail, is Jacquard loom, Joseph Marie Jacquard, who invented Jacquard's loom. Oh. So this comes along really early in the 19th century and then really forms the basis of a huge portion of the Industrial Revolution, because it had early programmability in it. You know, you had these punch cards, which are programmable instructions, really, they're like computer code, and that would do each line on the loom. And so out went cottage weaving, and in came factory production. But it was just a gigantic step forward, or a step backward for some of the people who lost their job, one could argue. But that's the precursor. Remember, this is before Babbage. And Babbage actually studied, he took inspiration from the Jacquard loom. And Ada Lovelace actually went on a tour around the Midlands to look at Jacquard looms. She was also fascinated by this. Her mother.
As we live in arty Brighton, I have some friends who are weavers, and they have a Jacquard loom in their attic, which I remember having a look at that and say it's run from a punch card, and this is interesting. There's an interesting metaphor. Probably forgot about it, but here we are again.
Yeah.
Okay, great introduction. So we're in the world of things and stuff in a way that we aren't a lot of the time. But we start with a mathematician and with logarithms, which I remember hating at school. Although I did have a slide rule that my father was an engineer.
As did I, yeah.
Charles Babbage, 1791 to 1871, was born in London, England. Charles Babbage was the son of a banker, Benjamin Babbage. Sounds like a Beatrix Potter character. And Betsy Plumley Teep. They both sound like Beatrix Potter characters. So Charles attended Trinity College, Cambridge, where he later became a mathematics professor. Babbage is renowned for conceptualizing the difference engine and the analytical engine, two very important early mechanical computers, both starting off mostly theoretical. Fun fact, Babbage once counted all the broken panes of glass in a factory to support his campaign against public nuisances. This was just one of his public campaigns. He was argumentative and rebarbative in his communications. Nowadays, he would have been many times cancelled, no doubt, but he would have a massive following on Twitter X because the algorithm would love him and his rage. Unlike some other high-profile contemporary figures we can mention who dominate that platform, he was also incredibly thin-skinned. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, maybe. We're back to these cheesy introductions. But, Donna, when it comes to assessing his impact on the history of computing, he undoubtedly threw a few stones into the mill pond of time whose ripples have lapped at many feet since, including our own. But maybe his influence was not really all that direct in that he conceptualized these machines. He didn't build them in his lifetime. How do you weigh up his work and his legacy?
Yeah, I think that was a really good summary there. There's one other thing I would add, just that the chair he had at Cambridge was Newton's chair. So this guy was this guy, that's the top chair in physics at the time, so in mathematics. So this guy was top, was no laggard when it comes to maths, and that was the root of all this thing. And he was desperate to find a way. What he recognized fundamentally was that human beings are really bad at maths cognitively. We just can barely add up 3 numbers in their mind, most people, because of the limitations of working memory. And he wanted to overcome the errors and limitations of human capabilities here in terms of what we can learn, so that machines would take out all the routine and drudgery from things. But what we have for the very first time here, and that's the important point, he is just number one here, is it's still a mechanical product. You're still in the world of cogs and machines and iron and so on. You can go and see one in the Science Museum because they've built it. But he moves from the machine to mind, if you want to put it that way. He suddenly gets a machine to do what minds can do, and even better, because this actually does, human calculations are often full of errors, I've just said. And he actually speculated on whether steam could be used to do it, but ended up producing something much more advanced than this, and spent his life trying to build such a machine. So that it was an amazing thing to set off with a single-minded determination, prickly though he was. This is someone you should admire because he actually went on and really spent a lifetime doing this. So he actually produces ideas, or at least plans, and they are exact. These are not like sketches, for a difference engine, and then that was followed by the analytical engine. And they're similar but different, and it's important to just get that out. Another important thing, just like sort of Elon Musk today, you might call it, he got a lot of government money for doing this. He kept falling out with all the government people because the government recognized, or somebody in the government recognized, that if you actually solve this problem and have a machine that does masses of calculation, it gives you this huge leap forward in commerce. And this is the British Empire. So if you get this right, the rewards are huge. You just slice out a whole lot of sort of bookkeeping and economy and you optimize things. So it's like early AI sort of thing. Now the difference engine, and it says the early 1830s, so it's a way back, early 19th century.
Yeah.
Okay. And so he's trying to automate mathematical tables, the tables that we had, at school. So he uses this thing called repeat addition. He uses this method called finite differences. It's a specialist method for addition. But he builds into the machinery, very sophisticated calculator, if you want to call it, your little calculator. But this thing was about the size of a small room. It's not going to be small at all. But it could do these polynomial functions, all sorts of advanced things, creating logarithm and trigonometry tables, such as we used on our slide rule. So this was elimination of errors. That's number one. He understood that was important, but also quite sophisticated, really number 3 in mathematics, but also some logarithms and trigonometry. So this is a huge advance, but he didn't stop there. He goes back to the government, asks for even more money to build what turned out to be the first general-purpose computer. General purpose.
This is such a typical investment story, wasn't it? They gave him loads of money to build this thing, and they came back to him and said, how's it going? He said, well, I haven't quite. Give us a bit more money. We've got to keep going on it. And he kept going on it. And then eventually, when they came back, said, oh, where is the thing? We keep giving you money. There is nothing here. He said, well, actually, I've got this other machine I'm doing now. So why don't you give me a load more money and I'll do that, not having seen the first. And, obviously, as he had this fancy chair at Cambridge, he kind of got away with it. But,
I think that's right. That's an interesting observation because it's the old adage, isn't it? Perfection is the enemy of the good. He was so smart. He was too smart for his own good, as it were. And just went on and on and on, always wanting perfection rather than sticking with something that would have worked and, would have been of benefit to society. That's quite a common thing in technology and companies, that everyone wants perfection. Actually, 80-90% is just as good. Yeah. So coming back to that the analytical engine, that's the second machine that he designed. That's far more complex. You're really talking about shifting the functionality away from the calculator, addition and multiplication and so on, to actually it's actually programmable, this thing, a general purpose computational engine, like the calculator bit, but it's actually programmable. That's what makes it really interesting. And it embodies all the logical features of a modern computer. It was an amazing leap, and it had so many of those components. So it had what he called the mill in the middle of it, and that's like a CPU, a modern chip in a computer. And that was for processing the operations. And that was a whole load of cogs and columns type thing. You can see it operating in the Science Museum. And then it has what he called a store, and that's literally the memory in your computer for storing intermediate calculations. So he's holding things in memory so that he can do more complicated algorithmic calculations on top of it. You need somewhere for storing the results you've received to operate upon them. So he's got memory. And then he has this conditional branching and loops type thing. And when we come to Turing, it's called a Turing complete theory, making it Turing complete. And it can really compute almost anything. Perform certainly any calculation. So computing almost anything is a wee bit too strong, but it could perform any calculation, not just predefined ones, Yeah. That's what makes it a general computer, the precursor, at least, to a modern computer. Now, remember, it's not binary, it's still a decimal type machine.
Yeah.
But wow, what an achievement. What an achievement.
An amazing achievement. It's never been built.
No. Yeah.
I mean, apparently they're working on it in Microsoft. A part of the problem is that he annotated his diagrams with a particular kind of annotation shorthand, which was peculiar to him. He made it up for himself. Nobody can read it. Yeah. And they're trying to decrypt it so that they can build the thing. And it is a process they reckon it's going to take them years to do it. But that's interesting because it kind of throws forward to stuff we'll be talking about later in terms of cryptography and code breaking and so on.
Yeah. They built the one you see in the Science Museum, you're right, is only part of one. Yeah. Henry Babbage, I think it was his son, tried to build it, didn't quite get there. And then I think it was in the 90s, the guy, we mentioned him later because he got to know a lot about the Lovelace stuff. This guy is really interesting. But the one that has been built, I mean, they built it. It was interesting, the Science Museum one, because they made it in the materials that were available just in that decade to the tolerances that were possible in the engineering. So it's very accurate for its time, but it's only part. It weighs 5 tons.
Wow.
So in a laptop.
No, absolutely. I think there's another one in Microsoft, actually, that they built in the 70s. Yeah. Right. And the anecdote I heard was that the only way that they could really build the whole thing and get it right was something to do with the spacing of the gears, was very exact in his specification and couldn't have been done really with the technology of the time. Right. But they could do it using computers. So the early design of the computer could never be built until the computer had been built that could build it. That's an interesting kind of snake eating its own tail sort of thing there. So I was talking about spirals, perhaps.
So, they're rounding off on him. He's called the father of computers.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair accolade, to be honest, even though it was never built and used in anger. It's sort of forgotten a lot, really. But nevertheless, that concept of a computer that can be used for problem solving or to learn things that we can't learn or extend our capabilities because we're only capable of doing so much. But this is a really meaningful step forward because it gave us the vision that technology could be used to extend the mind, and it also lays the groundwork for computational thinking, which was behind all that Hebb's and McCulloch and Pitt stuff that we did on our AI and learning podcast. So really significant figure there.
Ada Lovelace, 1815 to 1852, born Augusta Ada Byron in London, and that name should give you a clue to her parentage if you didn't know already. Ada Lovelace was the daughter of the poet Lord Byron and the mathematician Annabella Milbank. So don't forget the mathematician Annabella Milbank as well. Raised by her mother, she studied mathematics extensively and was mentored by mathematician Mary Somerville. And she collaborated with Charles Babbage later. She translated and annotated works on his analytical engine. Considered the first computer programmer, she conceptualized algorithms for machines. It should be said that her mother split up with her father, the poet Byron, who's a very bad man, very great poet, very bad man. And they split up very soon after they had Ada. And her mother was so fed up with Byron that she wanted Ada's education complete. I mean, this is maybe anecdotal, it may not be true, but she completely wanted Ada's education to avoid the arts. No poetry, no music, nothing fanciful. Maths. And that's kind of why she went into maths in the way that she did. Lovelace speculated, interestingly, that computers might someday compose music, foreseeing today's generative AI composing music, when really it should be doing more useful things like curing cancer. No doubt the daughter of one of England's greatest poets would have been tickled, though, to see a much later evolution of her imagined analytical engine that can not only compose music, but also crank out parodies of Byronic odes in seconds flat. Donald ignored for decades. Her importance in the development of computing may in some ways have been exaggerated more recently. She's become a great feminist icon, but she was a visionary thinker, and much more than a sort of retrospective DEI hire, wasn't she?
Yeah, very definitely. You're right in mentioning her mother here, who was like supposed to be very interested in mathematics, very good at mathematics. Her mother also helped establish the University of London, interestingly.
Oh, wow.
Which I thought was interesting. But it was what Babbage. It was the era of having soirees, and Babbage used to have these soirees in London. And her mother went along, and she described his engine as the thinking engine. She was quite smart in herself, as it were.
Yeah,
you're right. And they were both really interested in the Jacquard loom, going back to what we said earlier in the podcast. And they actually went on a tour around the Midlands to find out about the Jacquard loom. So there was a background to this. It's you're right. She's become a real heroine, rightly so, and we'll explore that in some detail. But I don't know if you saw the documentary on TV by Hannah Fry, who's a sort of science.
No.
She's a really good mathematician. She described her as a manipulative and aggressive drug addict, gambler, and adulteress. I thought, there's a line and a half in the review. But yeah, she was a bit like Babbage. She was a bit odd, and a bit prickly as well. And and had a reputation, as it were, for being, aggressive and a bit odd in that sense, but probably eccentric. But coming back to this, her link with Babbage, she gets very close to Babbage. Okay, the first computer's analytic engine, and they start to collaborate quite closely. But her real thinking didn't come directly from Babbage or working with them. She could speak several languages, well educated, as you rightly said in your introduction. And she took this Italian guy, because Menabrea, he had actually described Babbage's analytic engine in a long essay. And she not only translated it, but the interesting bit, she added really extensive notes and annotations to the translation.
Longer than the original.
Yeah, it was much longer than the original. That was absolutely brilliant. And these, of course, became quite famous. They actually got published. And it's there that you find all these core concepts that define modern computing, not computers, as it were. So she's trying to idealize what the potential is in such machines. And her first, observation, as it were, or revelation, is the concept of programming. In other words, you get these machines, and they can do way beyond mathematics and arithmetic. Let's not stick there. And she has this idea of an algorithm. Actually, the algorithm she chooses for Bernoulli numbers, so the Bernoulli effect is what keeps airplanes up in the air under the wing. But she lays this out in a sort of table. I've seen the notes, the original one, and it's very, very smart. She really goes to town on this in the notes. And it's said to be the world's first computer program. It's not quite. It's more like a series of sequential instructions that can be put into the engine. It's not quite a computer program. Nevertheless, it shows that fundamental input format as a piece of software that would drive the computer to have an output as your goal. That's a great insight. But she didn't just stop there. She wasn't a brilliant mathematician, and this is a sort of pseudocode, you might call it that, right? So, but she goes beyond that and has some insights into this notion of computation that are well beyond mathematical inference. And it's here that, as you rightly said earlier, she imagines that computation could be applied to the writing of literature, to the creation of music, to the creation of art. Now, this is way beyond its time, as it were. This notion from calculation to computation. This is the leap she makes, which Babbage didn't make, or did he? Which is interesting, because she's seen as the pioneer of this concept of computer programming, okay? But it's not, and she knew about the Jacquard frame thing, but the nature of that computation was also discussed by Babbage, okay? So she sort of thought music, art, literature, all that sort of stuff can be done, but so did others, and that's the problem here. So the guy who actually built the analytic engine in the Science Museum went back and looked at Babbage's notes and diaries and found that he had the similar thoughts, and actually more detailed and a more sophisticated form, and that it was perhaps she actually probably picked this up from him, if you see what I mean, as opposed to being the cause behind it. It doesn't really matter who came up with it. At the same time, between them, somehow this concept emerged into the world. But it didn't really emerge into the world because it had no significant impact. Turing was the first to pick up on it in the 1930s. So he picks up on Ada Lovelace's idea and comments on it. And it was a genius in a different sort of way. But she prefigures the sort of generative AI notion that computation might be able to produce music, art, language was one of the things she listed, and design. That's an astonishing thought for the time. And it's what's come to reality only recently. It's only now, really, that AI has actually been sprung upon us. Yeah. And, I had a friend of mine over who was a musician like you, John, by past, and he showed me, he was really keen. He always showed me new bands and stuff. Showed me this guy, Nick Hustles, who, it was amazing, great lyrics, great music. And then 2 weeks later, a bit shamefacedly emailed me or messaged me saying, I'm sorry about that, Donald, it was actually AI created. And this is actually happening now, we're getting people who can write, you're getting machines that can write, create literature, and also create music, and human beings can't tell. So it depends on what your view of art there is, whether that's right or not is a moral issue, really. But we've got there, we've realized her dream, interestingly.
Yeah. And it is interesting when, for a lot of the 20th century, we had this real division between arts and sciences in education, especially, but kind of in the rest of the world as well. And C.P. Snow, the novelist, famously complained about this, called it the two cultures. But it is interesting, particularly, although, as you say, Lovelace was picking up on things that Charles Babbage had thought about, her with this kind of schizophrenia in her family, the daughter of the poet and the mother, the mathematician, who swore steered her away from the arts, and yet it kind of leaps across that gap, the electricity of connection there that we're now seeing, as you say, in kind of AI. We're seeing that come back together because AI, a bunch of numbers, is now doing a load of stuff that people on the creative side of the fence do. Not least writing.
Well, you're right there. In that post-Enlightenment period, there wasn't this distinction between science and the rest. There were philosophers, poets, artists, scientists, everything, But in fact, the word scientist only comes along with, it was applied to a Scotswoman called Mary Somerville, who was an astronomer, and much later in the
no relation
century. Sorry?
No relation of her mother. Yeah.
In fact, I think she taught, I can't remember if she taught somebody who's in this list, I can't remember anyway, but the word scientist came in much later. The concept of science was a much later thing. But, in terms of, she prefigures something, going back to the learning thing there, you have in Ada Lovelace, that idea that machines could follow general instructions, algorithms, and learn from them, and it's a precursor to all the AI machine learning stuff. And it sort of inspires modern discussions about AI can mimic human learning through pattern recognition and so on. So I think she was well ahead of the game there. And of course, this was also as a woman, she was also quite interesting. She's become an icon in terms of women in the history of AI, certainly. But she was also an advocate for the intellectual, like her mother, for the intellectual development and education of women. And which was uncommon at the time. Remember, these people were few and far between, and they fought hard for it.
Yes.
And we covered that topic in our podcast in Berlin. The role in which women played was difficult because there was no entry point into educational institutions or scientific institutions for women. It was incredibly difficult, which is why you don't see many names. That's not to say they were not active and smart enough to come up with these ideas. And of course, Ada is a perfect example.
Yeah, of course. And she is one among many women important in that development around this time. Mary Wollstonecraft, who we covered,
Indeed.
and then perhaps slightly later George Eliot and so on.
That's right, yeah.
So we've had two real visionaries. It starts with again, anecdote city. Babbage was first moved to think about these things because he was disappointed with the number of typos that came back from printers in his log tables. The log tables being books, which we would have had at school in our time. And of course, typesetters were notorious for lots of typos, and there were so many typos in them, it kept going wrong. And he felt that the way to make this better was to have a machine that did it, because machines, of course, don't make mistakes. Ironically, here we are with ChatGPT that kind of can make all sorts of mistakes, as we know.
But not typos.
Well, yeah, not typos, absolutely. Yeah, they're still with us. But from these two massive visionaries, from that springs this great visionary effort of the two of them, which has got seeds in it that won't really be realised, until our own age.
That's right.
Perhaps. But from that, now we move to kind of more practically focused things. Herman Hollerith, 1860 to 1929. Born in Buffalo, New York, Herman Hollerith was the son of German immigrants George and Franziska Hollerith. Actually, it's quite interesting. This is a complete aside. Maybe we'll cut it out. But Buffalo is a place in New York. But I attended a kind of academic publishing conference a while ago, and everyone was using this thing to talk about how bad computers are at understanding language, natural language processing. And the example was the text string buffalo, 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 which because buffalo in that sentence is a place, it's a proper noun, it's not a proper noun, and it's a verb and an adjective as well, because to buffalo people is a verb. Just by the by.
It's also a sports team.
Sorry?
It's also a sports team in America.
And a sports team, yeah. Buffalo, 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 buffalo. Raised largely in New York City, Herman Hollerith studied engineering at Columbia University. Hollerith pioneered data processing using punched cards, greatly speeding the 1890 US Census. He founded the tabulating machine company, which later became known as a startup called IBM. It's said that Hollerith was inspired to create punch card machines by watching railway conductors punch holes in passenger tickets. Something, again, that I can remember seeing them do.
Yes.
Though completely obsolete by about 1990, punch card technology was absolutely vital to the development of computers in the 20th century. And it's amazing how late it did go on. The people we've heard about so far could more be called visionaries than inventors, perhaps. But Donald, is it with Hollerith and his railway conductor-inspired punch cards that we embark on the journey leading directly to digital computing and the data-driven world of today?
Well, that's right. The key word was data there, John, because
yes.
he recognized he was solving big data problems, primarily the US Census, which was taking literally months, if not years. And he sort of brought that down into just weeks, that big productivity leap. So this is a bridge into the real world here, with sophisticated technology, interestingly sophisticated, but also going back to Jacques Loon. He's using these little punch cards, and then they were all spring-loaded, and if there was a hole in the card, the spring would go through the hole and hit a little pool of mercury to complete the circuit. So you can see how that works very simply, beautifully, and super fast. I actually used punch cards in my first computer program ever when I was at school in Fortran for the computer on George IV Bridge in Edinburgh in the council. But the Jacques Loon thing was alive and kicking even when I was at school. But the notion here that you have an input method, those cards, which automate you can have that, it can produce an amazing tapestry, a woven tapestry, but it can also have an amazing amount of complex commands and instructions and indeed data in software. So that's what he recognized. He was working for the US Census. He gets this machine, he builds it, he patents all the punch card idea before he builds the machine. And he made sure that he could record all the human characteristics that were necessary in the census. And that included things like your race, gender, your skills you had, and so on. We'll come to this in a minute, because it was really the precursor to the modern LMS as well. It actually listed the skills you would have, what your job was. Wow. Yeah, it was really interesting. But we'll come to an interesting anecdote about that in a minute. These punch cards are then run over these Mercury things. And so he's using electricity for the first time, electronics for the storing of data. Very interesting, that leap. But it wasn't just the storing of the data. You can then do things with that data. So he had two things, a combinatorial mechanism, so you can match up traits. So are you male? Do you do plumbing? Are you Italian or whatever? You can tabulate all these different things and link them together, and also calculate totals, which is important for a census. What percentage of the population have these traits. Okay? Now that went down from 8 years to a single year. He took it down to a year. From 8 years. It's a massive increase in productivity. Yeah. That's why America was full of that energetic, just like the UK, the doing of things, the building of machines, the raising the game and productivity so that everybody could gain. And I think that's what we're going through with AI currently as well. Whether everyone will gain is another question, but it's similar. The problem is similar. So he then goes on to create, he was a real business guy as well. This is important as well. He's a bit sort of like an Elon Musk of his day. He creates a company called Tabulating Machine Company, and that eventually becomes IBM. Okay? Now, but this is where it all leaps into the Fortran COBOL type stuff, because these card systems were still used when I was at school. Okay? But it doesn't matter whether it's cards or typing in your computer instructions. It doesn't really matter. The principle is there for efficient input or data entry. That could be cards, or they could be read at high speed as well, which is more common, or magnetic tape was used. All sorts of systems for input were used. But he gave us that. Now, it had a downside here, and I'll tell you the story because it's quite interesting. In about 2013 or something, I was in the United States at the learning conference, Elliott Mazie conference. I don't know if you ever went.
Oh, yeah.
And the Americans always like to have breakfast meetings. This was early in the morning, 8:30. And bleary-eyed, I went along to this, and Elliot and the panel gave presentations on LMSs and their functionality. And I had read a book at the time by a guy called Black, which was called IBM and the Holocaust, and it was all about Hollerith. So Hollerith builds this machine. IBM built a really sophisticated version of it, and then Tom Watson, who was the CEO of IBM, shoots across the Atlantic, meets Hitler. There's a picture of Tom shaking Hitler's hand and selling him a Hollerith machine. And this whole book was about it. It was really fascinating. And I brought up, my question to Elliot was, well, the trouble with LMSs is surveillance. You don't want to be in a system where every time you get C in a multiple choice question or pause for a minute, you're being judged. It's against the natural law of learning. You want to let people go at their own pace and so on. And he went apeshit at me. He did. And what I didn't realize until much later, another American said, Donald, you didn't notice, did you? The sign behind him. IBM were sponsors of the conference.
Oh.
So, and he's never spoken to me since. I don't think, Elliot. But it was interesting, that there are consequences. Technology always has consequences. And actually, the Hollerith machine was used in the final solution. It marked people down as gypsies, homosexual, and so on. And we know what the consequences of that were.
Gas ovens.
Exactly. It's horrific. And therefore, that's why we have to reflect a little bit on data issues, because when they're used to bad ends, they're used to bad ends, and we have historical precedents for some of this stuff.
Isn't it always the case with technology that it has good uses and bad uses? It doesn't care. Technology doesn't know whether it's a good use.
Yeah, it's amoral in that sense. It's what we use it for that causes all the problems.
Yeah.
The Hollerith thing result, there's a good side, good and bad side to everything, as it were. It comes through all this, And the legacy of the whole Hollerith machine is that it comes through, and we have data. The dealing with data in software becomes a big deal. Data processing practices, the whole big data thing, which is now foundational to AI and foundational to the way we use technology to learn now, because a large language model is trained by data. In other words, the sum total of our cultural capital. And so we have the culmination of the Hollerith machine is actually a large language model, a data-trained entity. And so we have him to thank for that. Then, the whole notion of learning analytics, and how the census machine was used to analyze data for a social good. They wanted to know who was in America and what they had to do to change government policy. Remember, it's all government type stuff. Yeah. The census, very different from the government in Nazi Germany, but the Americans wanted to improve life. They were it was for progress, genuine human benefits and a democracy. So I think he's very, very interesting as a bridge into the practical world.
Yeah. So you've kind of mentioned him as an example of productivity gains, but is there something there also about if you look at what was the need that led to the development of this technology? This is the time with growth of populations, massive expansion of cities, the railways and electrification bringing about all this kind of extra mobility and increasing the birth rates and so on, despite wars and Spanish influenza and so on. The birth rate was growing a great deal due to industrialization, people moving around a lot. So there was simply a kind of much larger amount of information needed to be gathered in order for governments to really kind of control those territories. And of course, with colonial expansion earlier in the 19th century, you had governments becoming much larger and having to deal with larger amounts of data. So was it really a need for something that couldn't be counted by hand with kind of marks on a stick or crosses on paper that this stuff responded?
There's a very interesting thing bounces out of this, John. Just come to me because I've just finished a book called The Technological Republic, and it's about America and the history of this stuff. So the premise to this book is that Silicon Valley actually got waylaid here, into producing a whole load of whimsical, the whims of capitalism, he calls it, the author. And the whims of capitalism is things like social media, putting filters on your TikTok picture.
Getting AI to compose poems for you.
Yes, exactly. In other words, and produce another app that nobody wants, In other words, or selling ads, That's actually what Silicon Valley became. All this beautiful, amazing, and how it went from Hollerith, who were trying to do social goods for government through census, to suddenly technology that was just serving shallow narcissistic needs. It's very odd that happened. Actually, the book then goes on, quite rightly, I think, to say this is what's great about the AI thing. We're suddenly going, well, this could be used. Well, hold on a minute. You didn't do anything in education or healthcare, but AI is. So AI comes along and suddenly the whole of Silicon Valley goes, let's forget the filters on Facebook. Let's focus on things like healthcare and increasing productivity and education and all those social goods. I think we're going back to the Hollerith days, and I think that's a great thing. The downside is that maybe the book is also written by a guy who is the chief executive of Palantir. So it may also be he's realistic about this, and I sort of agree with him. He said the mistake is not to imagine that this won't be applied to national security and weapons. And he says that the US must protect themselves against the obvious enemy for them, that's China. So there's some interesting things that have emerged from this when you ask that question that you rightly asked there, John. What do we use technology for? Social good or not? Because actually Silicon Valley hasn't done that for decades. It's produced social media, not social good. So I think now we may be emerging into an era where we can finally realize some of the dreams that people like Hollerith and Ada Lovelace had, where it's doing good things.
Okay. And if it's not too kind of tendentious a link, when it comes to technology, computer technology coming about in this era, growing rapidly to deal with the problems of scale of information. Part of the reason for the growth of e-learning was the growth of scale of organizations and globalizations. Global organizations just couldn't physically afford or logistically deploy the number of humans they needed to do all the training.
Yeah.
And of course, with the growth of regulation, more and more regulation, more and more compliance learning, you just couldn't have done that without technology. So learning technologies are given the impetus of this need. So we're teasing out a lot of needs for this growth, like, more accurate logbooks, handling loads and loads of data. And I think it's really interesting that the data question the data thing we talk about so often nowadays comes before the actual invention of what we would recognize as a computer.
That's right. Data needs. You're right.
Vannevar Bush, 1890 to 1974, the year coincidentally when I started university. So it kind of brings it into my lifetime at least. Born in Everett, Massachusetts, Vannevar Bush was the son of Universalist minister Richard Perry Bush and Emma Linwood Payne. He studied at Tufts University and MIT, becoming a professor and administrator at both institutions. A pioneering engineer and science administrator, Bush coordinated scientific research during World War II, laying foundations for computing and hypertext with his visionary concept, the Memex, which he'll tell us all about, no doubt, Donald. Arguably, Bush's Memex concept directly inspired hypertext and modern-day internet hyperlinks. Donald, would you argue for or against that idea?
Yeah, I mean, all the people in this is the man I probably most admire, curiously, and because he would, in your little roundup, he was clearly a man who did things. He was dean of the school at MIT in engineering, and he, a real practical bloke. And interestingly, I don't know if you I think you mentioned that, but his family were sea captains and whalers.
So were mine. My
really
forebears were sea captains. Yes,
out in Norway.
Yes, but then they got into maritime insurance and ended up in the city of London.
There's a leap.
Not whalers.
And he put down all his qualities to that sort of hard life that his close relatives had been involved in. Very interesting. But he's a practical guy, And the interesting thing about him was this is the era where in America you filed a lot of patents, which is exactly what he did. Now, on the computer side, he picks up from Babbage really and builds this thing called a differential analyzer. Okay. So this is quite visionary because if you combine it with the idea you just put forward there of the Memex, call that the World Wide Web for a minute, then he brings a number of big ideas together in one mind. Okay, so this differential analyzer is a bit like the analytical engine of Babbage, but more arguably the first computer because the other one was more of a calculator. And it was interesting because it was analog but also electrical mechanical device. At that time you had mechanical engineer was still there. We had electricity, of course, but things still used analog approaches. But nevertheless, it had these 6 disks, and this was massive, another massive machine, again, the size of a room, but it could solve mathematical equations. And this is a leap forward, this algebraic formulation with up to 18 variables, which is a hell of a lot. You can do a lot with 18 variables. So he's building this stuff, and a bit like he's later, at this time, though, the switches are vacuum tubes and binary, within the electrical circuit. So we've got this leap forward in the underlying technology, but also in the vision. Now, boy, was he a visionary. He was lucky because he was very close to Roosevelt, In fact, headed up his national research.
Franklin D. rather than Theodore.
Right, yeah. So and then he eventually became in charge of not in charge, but he put together and envisioned the Manhattan Project, which many argue shortened the Second World War for the US and Japan. Others would argue against that. Nevertheless, he was a visionary guy. He was really physics. He was like Elon Musk. He really liked bringing things back to first principles and the principles of physics especially. But he had a massive interest in learning. So let's bring the word, that's what these podcasts are about. He really did believe that solving the learning problem, and I was getting technology to do all those things as Hollerith did, taking the drudgery, as he called it, out of life, would leave us time for more learning and more intellectual pursuits and capabilities. That was a really strong thing for Vannevar Bush. Now, what he did was he set the scene for the rest of history in America in terms of research, which is why America became the greatest economy in the world, the greatest democracy in the world, and helped us win 2 world wars. That may have gone back a tad recently, but nevertheless, some wonderful things happened there. And it was down to him. So when he founded the National Science Foundation, he had a vision, which he took to the president, which was, you have 3 things here. You have academia, who does all the basic research, the foundational research. You make sure you use that properly. You have the private sector that can realize the research and build real things with it. And then you have government who can help with some of the funding. So those 3 legs to that stool are still in place today in America. And in the early days, you had the Bell, everything we know of in computers today, Bell Labs, the Rand Corporation, Xerox PARC, all that, all was because of him. And boy, did it deliver. It delivered for America. And of course, we in Britain, if we reflect for a moment on Babbage and even Turing and others, and Flowers, we will speak about in a minute, we had amazing intellects who had amazing ideas and built amazing things and did nothing with them because academia doesn't like the private sector, the government, it was never a stool. The 3 things remain to this day very separate and almost at war with each other for some reason. But the Americans didn't take that view, which is why we have Silicon Valley. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing is, the word you mentioned is that mimics idea, John. That idea was like a giant Wikipedia, basically, with hyperlinks between it all, just like Wikipedia. And you could vector through the mimics. This is all his ideas way back. I mean, you're talking about 1945, when the very famous article he wrote, which was called, I've forgotten, As We May Think, I think, as we think or something. Anyway, in that article, you vector through the mimics, but you can also create your own vectors and they get stored. This is very similar to what's happening with AI currently, actually, the large language model type thing when you use ChatGPT and so on. But it's these associative trails, and you can create new trails, but it's all hyperlinked, all driven by you as an agent, okay? And behind it all is this huge motherload of knowledge and skills and all sorts of things, okay? Now, not only did he predict that, he goes on to predict social media, because this notion that you add your own stuff, user-created content, is also in this amazing essay. It's an absolutely astounding thing to read. And then on top of that, if that wasn't enough, he then envisions blogging, because he thinks that if you create content, you therefore need a mechanism for sharing that with other people. Yeah. So all of that stuff, social media, blogging, the World Wide Web, the concept of Wikipedia, are all in this one article. And he thought this would, if we realized this dream, we'd get this massive leap forward in productivity, which is what happened with the internet. He was so ahead of his time, it's almost beyond belief. And indeed, much later, he writes a book about this going by, and he wasn't, he was a guy of some humility. He said, I got it all right, and it's all down to me. But actually, he's still going hard, saying, because by then other technology, magnetic tapes had come along, and he thought there was ways of using magnetic tape to create and also erase content. In such a way that you could create. This is really anticipating machine learning, to be honest. It's anticipating exactly what happens when you use a large language model with things like back propagation. You think that was the concept they have, but it's heading in that direction. That is the trajectory. Yeah. So I think that what I love about Vannevar Bush is just it's the depth and the breadth. He thought about almost everything, but in a very practical way, and set us on a trail where that could be eventually realized, and realized it was.
So how influential were these ideas? Were they just kind of thrown out there to sort of be ignored and then picked up by historians of the field and podcasters like us, or were they immediately influential on the people that we're going to go on to talk about?
Oh, no. He's guiding government funding here. Yeah. So the Manhattan project, of course, gets funded to an enormous degree to win the war, but then all the post-war labs, Bell Labs, SRI was another one, the Xerox PARC and so on, were all funded from the government and bringing academia together with the private sector, and that they created. In fact, his influence was enormous. There's another one, I can't remember if we've covered him in the podcast now, John. We've done so many. Douglas Engelbart was...
Yes, we covered him.
We did cover him, right, that's good. Because Engelbart had the famous mother of all demos where he showed a mouse, a computer monitor, modern computer, all in one demo. It was the most amazing thing, apparently. But of course, that was all Bush's ideas, really. He was just building on Bush and acknowledged that it was Bush's, to be fair to Engelbart. So, and then Ted Nelson, there are two other people in there. There's Tim Berners-Lee, of course, the World Wide Web. He quotes Bush all the time. And he's the World Wide Web, he makes direct. He said, without Bush, we don't have any of this stuff. And then Ted Nelson, the hypertext guy. And my friend Ian Ritchie, who had a hypertext company called OWL, also Vannevar Bush, is his greatest ever hero. And he thinks that he's vastly underrated or under-acknowledged or underappreciated in terms of the eventual creation of the internet.
Right, so the Memex, which is an entirely kind of theoretical thing for Bush, then kind of goes into the body of technologists, of the group of technologists who are carrying on this legacy, and inspires people to create a lot of the things that follow. Really interesting.
Yeah, and you can trace those lines, the line of acknowledgement, if you want to call it, the inspiration, would be a better word to use, because he inspired, he and Engelbart and all sorts of people inspired the next generation to go on and push and push and push until we end up at AI.
Another thing that's I should have mentioned earlier, perhaps, is it's interesting with the earlier people like Babbage and Lovelace. This is an age when scientific communication is becoming very important. I mean, that started off late 18th century with the Royal Society, publication of journals, but also letters between scientists, enormously important in the development of science during the 19th century, and Darwin's letters and so on, very, very much studies. And communication between scientists carries on being a really important thing, and whether they publish or not. You go back kind of to the early modern period, Da Vinci invented loads and loads of things that he never published, so they just stayed in his notebooks. But now we're into an age of scientific and technological communication that is providing fuel for future developments. So
and that was Vannevar Bush's idea. He thought that the advancement of science would be massively accelerated, and it actually happened with the ARPANET. The early version of the internet was for the exchange of scientific academics and science. That's what the wellspring for the internet was.
Yes, now it's for laughing babies and rage. Maxwell Newman, 1897 to 1984, and Thomas Flowers, 1905 to 1988. Newman, born in Chelsea, London, studied at St John's College, Cambridge. Amazing how many of these people are actually from London. And quite a few of them from Cambridge as well. Later teaching mathematics there and at Manchester, another great centre of English life. Flowers from London's East End, another great centre of English life. Apprenticed as a mechanical engineer and working at the General Post Office's research station at Dollis Hill. We can see there's a kind of class differential there straight away, the mathematician and the engineer. Together at Bletchley Park during World War II, Newman designed the logic behind Colossus, the world's first electronic digital computer, engineered by Flowers. Fun fact, Flowers personally financed part of Colossus after official skepticism about its feasibility, which is interesting. You think of the amount of money that's piled into developing computing nowadays. They were skeptical about it, found it hard to get the funding. Some might say that with Colossus, they created a monster, but others will not. Where do you stand?
Yeah, well, I'm a great fan of the underdog, the unsung hero, as it were, and Tommy Flowers is one of those people. An apprentice in the post office, as you rightly said, because the headquarters was in or near London.
Yeah, massive data operation, apart from anything else.
Yeah, massive, exactly, yeah. And of course, he was one of those guys who did evening classes, to get a degree in electronic engineering. And then he becomes he's obviously a super smart guy. He builds this massive machine with 3,000 vacuum tubes in the post office to deal with the data issues you just mentioned there, John. And that's to do with 1,000 telephone lines that's emerged at that time. They weren't all into homes, or mostly between businesses at that time. But it was Turing. Interesting. It was Turing who actually introduced Tommy Flowers into Bletchley Park. Because he spotted that the guy was a genius and that he could actually build things as opposed to just talk about and lecture about them. Max Newmans was a professor at Cambridge, and the thing that really is horrible here is Flowers was really an impoverished guy and spent his own money building Colossus. Max Newman wasn't poor. Max Newman got a knighthood, and it wasn't until the 90s that they recognised Tommy Flowers with an OBE. It's the most obvious example of stupid class snobbery I've seen in the history on all the podcasts we've done, because Tommy Flowers is the hero of the day here, And although Max Newman had taught Turing, so there's a line there as well, but Turing brings in Flowers into Bletchley Park, and basically this is late in the war, things are getting hairy, and he produced the first Colossus machine. It's an amazing computer. There is actually a huge exhibition on at the moment in Bletchley Park where you can see the story of this. Now, why was Colossus important? Well, it was absolutely vital to intercept German messages, okay? And there were amazing examples of this. So Eisenhower was supposedly in the room when a decoded message was handed to him showing that Hitler saw all the D-Day preparations that were taking place right along the south coast. They were worried that Hitler, would be able to predict when they were going to land, and therefore it wouldn't have worked. So Eisenhower, they intercepted a message that is saying that Hitler thought that D-Day preparations were a feint. They were a false feint. So Eisenhower said, we go tomorrow. And it worked, of course. And then another famous example of things like intercepting messages so that when the parachutists landed, they weren't landing near German positions, tank divisions and so on. So these guys saved lives, if not helped win, and almost certainly helped win the Second World War. This is how important it was. This is the defeat of fascism here, right? Partly inside a computer, okay? And by the end of the war, they had built 10 of them, 10 colossi, and they were intercepting things like crazy. Of course, Turing was working on the cryptography and all this, the mathematics of it all, okay? Now, that Colossus thing is interesting because they kept it classified, so he could never get Tommy Flowers never got any recognition at all for any of this. And that's what it makes me slightly angry to think they had to wait till 1991 before the Queen Elizabeth, where she died, gave him a paltry OBE, whereas his boss automatically got a knighthood. It's that craziness of that, really.
That was terrible. But the secrecy there was intense. I know my wife's grandfather was at Bletchley Park during the war, and he was liaison between what was going on at Bletchley and Churchill, and used to go and give Churchill the latest updates in his pajamas. And this didn't come out till long after the war, but Kate's grandmother, Sybil, said she used to stick pins under his fingernails to try and make him tell her what he was doing.
Yes.
But he wouldn't, and he never spoke about it. And so many people from the Bletchley years just never, ever took to their graves those secrets. The secrecy was intense.
Oh, yeah.
For probably quite obvious reasons.
I think that's right. And I mean, you have a whole development after the war. You can see how it's secret because you're into the Cold War then. Then after the war, you have people like John von Neumann, who another great genius here, and he brings the stored programs and memory into the mix here,
right?
With a thing called the von Neumann architecture, and that's 45, but it wasn't used in the war so much. But the von Neumann becomes incredibly, and the concept of a single processor for multiple tasks, that's von Neumann. And then you have people building computers like ENIAC, EDVAC, EDSAC. There's a whole lot of computers that build upon the Colossus idea. So EDSAC, the ENIAC, I think, was the first electronic general purpose type computer. EDVAC is got stored computer programs on it. So that's the next development forward. And then the EDSAC is the first stored program computer to run a real practical task. And that's much later by 49, but still in that post-war period, almost immediately it led to this mushrooming, a sort of Cambrian explosion of interest in computers. And then Fortran, the program I use, I think it was written in the late 50s when I was born, 56. But just after that eventually became the punch cards that I and many others use. Then we have the microchip revolution, and a good deal later with Kilby and Noyce. So there's a whole lot of people flow out of this post-war.
Yeah.
We're in the Cold War, hence the secrecy. So that was your point there, John. Yeah, you're right.
So, Alan Turing, 1912 to 1954. Born in Maida Vale, London, another Londoner. Alan Turing was the son of Julius, a British civil servant, and Ethel Turing, educated at Sherborne School and King's College, Cambridge, so public school and Cambridge again. Turing later worked at Princeton. He played a crucial role at Bletchley Park, developing techniques to decipher Nazi codes, notably with the bomb machine. Turing's theoretical work laid foundations for computer science and artificial intelligence. Fun fact, an avid runner, Turing nearly qualified for Britain's 1948 Olympic marathon team.
Oh.
Not so fun fact, persecution by the authorities when it was revealed that he was gay after the war probably caused his suicide. Times have changed, hopefully. Let's hope they don't change back again. There's no denying that he has had a huge and enduring influence over the field. Donald, how would you sum that up? And is his importance for AI just about the Turing test, or does it go deeper than that?
No, because there is the Turing test. And funnily enough, the Turing test has turned out to be the less important aspect of Turing's work. And as you mentioned there, he's doing this other work, very practical work, of course, in Bletchley Park, the genius that he was. But at the same time, or a bit later, really, papers, right from the 30s to the 1950s, he's writing these foundational papers that have this massive influence on the future, because he's laying the floor of the groundwork for all this computational and the philosophical theories that you need really to conceptualize and figure out what you're going to do with this technology, because it's getting more powerful. And so he lays down a lot of things, some of which he gets right and some of which he gets wrong. I mean, we can come to the Turing test, because I don't know, do you want to do the Turing test first, or what would you like to do?
No, let's do the other stuff first, because people will know about the Turing test. Other stuff would be less familiar.
Yeah, so a fundamental concept which is still around today is a thing called the Turing machine. Okay,
Yes.
So this is really taking the brain, and what are we as human beings? Well, we have all these amazing capabilities. How does that map onto a machine? Okay, this came out of the war effort because you're trying to predict cryptographic messages and so on. So this is in 36, this is before the war. Here's this concept of the Turing machine, and that's a theory of computers, okay, or a theory of computation, to be more accurate. And so on compatible numbers or computable numbers, no, that's wrong, not compatible numbers, he comes up with this idea that you have a tape in a head that can read symbols as it passes by at great speed, okay? And that means it can operate all these computational algorithms or whatever, computation in general. Now, he calls this a universal theory of computation. You can basically simulate the logic of any computational process, anything you want. That's what he tried to imagine. Or he asked the question, can you actually simulate anything? Is everything computational? Now, this goes back to another mathematician, a German with a very English name of David Hilbert, interestingly.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you've heard that name before.
Hilbert space, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So Hilbert also asked this question, is there a step-by-step method, an algorithm, that's what we call it now, that can solve every mathematical problem? Or are there some problems that can never be solved by a mechanical process? Now, Turing's answer is no. There are problems that no machine could ever solve, but actually they're wrestling with this problem. And actually, the great thing is that there's just so much that can be computated, is computational, that comes out of this. So the Turing machine is a sort of simple hypothetical machine, okay, call it a Turing machine, that follows step-by-step instructions to solve any mathematical or logical problem. and that can read, write, and erase symbols on an infinite strip of tape. That was the thought experiment, much like a sort of modern computer reading and processing data. This is a sort of an amazingly advanced thing for 1936, the thought experiment itself. If a problem could be solved by such a machine, you could say it was computable. If that makes sense. So that freed up the whole world for computation. Was what could be represented and solved by computational methods. Almost everything. Not everything, according to Turing, but almost everything.
Is this where we get that phrase, Turing complete?
Yeah, that's right.
What that
Exactly.
means. Yeah. So a machine can be Turing complete.
That's right. That's exactly what that...
If it does that,
yeah. That's correct. And then the second, the thing you mentioned was the Turing test. Now, the Turing test is interesting because he writes that much later in a very famous paper that everybody in AI knows called Computing Machinery Intelligence, 1950. And he puts forward another thought experiment, which is his famous Turing test, okay? And to explain that really simply for a minute, he said, he's asking that question, can machines think? Can a machine think? Can the AI think? And so he has to have a problem, he has to have a definition of thinking, but he proposes this practical test, okay, for machine intelligence, famous Turing test. Now, this is a very simple thing. You have a judge, okay? So you have this experiment, you have a judge sitting there, and it interacts with both the human and the machine through a text-based conversation, okay? But you don't get any visual clues. So you don't know if it's a human or a machine. If the judge cannot tell reliably what is human and what's the machine has passed the test. Okay? Quite clever, you think. And it is. And it stood the test of time because nobody ever sort of really beat it. Okay? Turing's key arguments for all sorts of things, about machines and so on. But the Turing test actually did prove to be one of a more inadequate test. It was too simplistic and flawed. But you can see why almost immediately, because we have a very sophisticated view of AI now and why it would be flawed. The first thing is the Turing test can measure just deception, So Eliza, that very early famous AI bot, just mimicked what you said by repeating nouns. So it was deceiving you into thinking it had understanding, but it didn't have anything at all. There was no reasoning, wasn't intelligent at all. And some still argue that chatbots, for example, are playing the same test. They don't understand anything. I don't think that's true because they have reasoning and all sorts of other features that are quite different from Eliza. But in other words, it isn't measuring real intelligence because it can be fooled. You can fool it in. That test is inadequate because you can fool it into thinking you do. And some other people think it's just a sort of stupid test because it's exploiting a weakness in human psychology, which we all have, which we're easily fooled. So the judge is easily fooled. So
I was going to say, we turn out to be much easier to fool than a lot of people think, really.
That's exactly it, John. And then John Searle, the philosopher, very famously, much later in the 1980s or something, I remember studying this at university, he has this Chinese room idea. So, you receive Chinese characters, you follow a rule book in the room, and you output English. Okay, from the outside, it seems fluent, but it doesn't understand the language at all. The person is just translating blindly, as it were. So Searle's point is a machine can follow the rules, generate responses, but without any comprehension whatsoever, just like a chat.
Yeah.
But
and Gödel's theorem comes into this as well. Roland Penrose, I think, says that it proves that AI can't think because of Gödel's theorem.
Yeah, and Hofstadter is still a great skeptic around AI. I'm not wholly convinced by his arguments, but you're right. That was another attack on the Turing test as well. And of course, there's other things like AI lacks context, emotion, and common sense, and all that sort of stuff. So even advanced AI struggles with humor and all that sort of stuff. So it can't really, that means it's almost certainly going to fail the Turing test on that front. And then, of course, we've got the whole specialized AI versus general intelligence thing. What does passing the Turing test mean? Does it mean it's just very good at chess or coding or medical diagnosis, or is it a general test? That's why the various tests and benchmarks for AI now are quite disparate. There's a whole number of benchmarks here. A Turing test on its own is no longer adequate. New benchmarks. And some of the new benchmarks were really good. There's a very famous thing called the Vinograd Schema Challenge. That's that tests reasoning and common sense. Very difficult thing to pass. But we're getting, of course, AI is starting to pass all of these things and all the high-end mathematical, scientific, and logical problem solving. It's absolutely acing. It's becoming a genius mathematician.
Yes.
And even embodied, you can even have benchmarks for, which Google have just published something on this, which is you can have a test for a robot, for example, as to whether it's truly intelligent and performing tasks. So we've abandoned the Turing test, but the great thing was it set us in motion. That's why we should not be critical of Turing here. We should praise him because actually we've built on the idea And to be fair, I mean, when he came up with this, you know, we have thousands of kind of examples that we can look at of machines that you know, apparently can think and can reason and can do and write kind of Byronic couplets. But you know, it was entirely theoretical at the time that he was talking about, and that's right.
You know, most people thought, you know, well, what are you talking about? It's just kind of a load of cards and, you know, a big machine with lots of valves in it and so on.
I mean, that's right. It's just the sheer genius of imagining problem as to be solved now, but will affect the future. You know, it's all well in the future, but he's conceptualizing it as a superbly high level, and laying the foundations for all. Again, we're building in the old cliche shoulders of giants, and he's one of those people, undoubtedly.
So if we come back to that thing of the needs that inspired this, and you look at what they were doing in Bletchley, the Enigma machine, which we haven't mentioned, is a very important part of this. You know, very well covered ground in sort of popular culture and everything else. And it was interesting that the code breaking effort relied so much on trying to work out what was happening at the other end of this kind of cryptography screen, if you like, that you couldn't see behind. You know, to decode it, you had to kind of the Enigma machine was kind of a load of wheels that would turn and so substitute letters. And it could be 3 gears, and then it was 4, and the Navy added extra ones because it wasn't secure enough. Then the Air Force added their own, and so on. So it got harder and harder program to solve. And the people at Bletchley, the code breakers, were trying to kind of think about what was happening with this machine as a physical machine at the other end of it. And the people who were decoding the messages felt that they could, if I think I'm right, could identify who the operators were who were doing certain amounts of the encoding and what machine it was on. The whole enterprise was kind of like a bit of, they were trying to do mind reading with computers, with maths, as it were. And it was all that thing about trying to know what was happening in the mind of another remotely without the physical stimuli that we rely on in kind of face-to-face interaction, which is, in a way, it's logical that we end up with the Turing test from that, because the whole thing is kind of trying to second guess what's going on in another mind behind a screen of.
It's going to become a really big thing when AI becomes embodied, of course, in robots. Myriad of robot forms. They won't all be humanoid and so on, and they're already in your cars and all that sort of stuff. So it's interesting, and I think you picked up on something really interesting there as well in the Enigma machine, which is, we forget about this, but of course we're all in a sea of AI all the time. It's what stops you getting the dick pics in your social media. It protects your financial accounts, your health records, because it's very good at recognizing things that are harmful. So people think AI has lots of harms, but it's actually most of the time protecting you. You hardly ever see weird stuff like that because AI is doing the job before. And that whole notion of encryption or cryptography as an art, I mean, we had that goes throughout the Middle Ages. There are lots of people who were involved in that. But it wasn't really until the 70s that you got real data encryption standards, DES standards. Public key cryptography was a big thing. This is all in the 70s, much, much later. But of course, these guys had been working on all this stuff during the war. And the war was a great accelerator on all this. And now we have amazing, end-to-end encryption is just everywhere. And that's what these guys were working on at the time. That was their vision. Now looking at, interesting, the quantum compute stuff's coming along. So you got a thing called quantum cryptography, which looks as though it's going to be a great solution to that problem as well, because AI tends to start to break things, which is annoying. But we've gone through some amazing minds here, all of who have been, have given us the sort of legs on a stool, as it were, or multiple legs on a structure that has led to where we are today. And the acceleration and rate of pace has been phenomenal. And what I like about this group is they all have a direct link into the AI thing, because that is the technology of the age. The resistance is future is going to be here. That's what we live with and within now.
Anything more to say about Turing? Perhaps more on the learning side before we move to sum up.
On the learning side, well, I think Turing really, it's his realization. I mean, he's studying how far you can take computing. How far can it learn? So he's comparing, remember, the Turing test is all about comparing the human mind with the machine. His exploration of the limits of computation, mean how far can we take this? And then he picks up on Lovelace and so on, because he thought her ideas were amazing. And then tries to imagine a future where these things will have such an amazing effect. What is it like to be a baby that is trained, and a computer that's trained like a baby? In other words, he's even discussing embodied intelligence in humanoid forms. And this is all relevant in terms of how we will be using that technology as human beings, because we're clearly cognitively capped. He understood that. We're not even good at arithmetic, really add up numbers and so on. And all those cognitive weaknesses we have, we're highly emotional, we flit all over the place, sleep 8 hours a day, we die, all that stuff. He understood that computation was so powerful that it would transcend human capabilities. But just because it transcends our capabilities, at first in chess and Go, nobody gave a toss about that, but now it transcends our capabilities in cognitive tasks that we do in the workplace, that starts to worry people. And that's where we are at. We're seeing the culmination of the theorizing, but it's manifested itself in the real world. It's giving us lots of ethical dilemmas. Nevertheless, I really do believe that we shouldn't be scared of this, and that we should be pointing to this towards the social good. It's a very good book coming out called Super Agency by Chief Executive of LinkedIn, and he's giving this positive view of agency as something that will free us from the drudgery of life, which is what Vannevar Bush talked about, to allow us to have more agency in life and do what we actually want to do, as opposed to the complete artificiality of turning up to an office at 9 o'clock and leaving at 5. It's been a long time since I did that, and when I have to do it, it strikes me as a very bizarre thing. And therefore, I'm not wholly convinced that people have got the right idea about the dignity of work. And actually, most people don't work in an office anyway. Most people in healthcare and so on are working out in the practical world. And I think the sooner we can help them with embodied AI, the better. So I think I'm a realist, but I'm also, people would call me an optimist in technology, because I think we've always been able to manage the downsides.
You'd be in disagreement with Jamie Dimond then, I suppose.
Lots of people, almost everybody disagrees with me, Josh.
So to sum up, we've heard a story of how a need for maths nerd Charles Babbage to get more accurate log tables led to visions of a new type of machine, how the data demands of industrialized industries and government services at scale, and then during wartime the needs of code breakers, created practical routes to achieving the visions of Babbage and Lovelace. But how do we draw these threads together with the story of AI, which we've talked quite a bit about AI and machine learning and the development? How does that lead us into the development of digital learning, and what can we learn about learning from this steampunk history?
Well, I think we had the podcast where all those people like from Hebbs onwards, right up to Demis Hassabis, were seriously interested in cognitive science. That was, they looked at the science of the brain, okay? And then on the other side, we have these sort of genius mathematicians and computer-orientated people who come to the conclusion that thinking is computation. Now, I do believe that thinking is computation. I believe in the computational theory of the mind. Many don't. And that's why we have, we did a whole podcast on this as well in terms of the extended mind. So you have all sorts of people like Chalmers and so on who believe that technology is really an extension of the mind, and even consciousness. When you're using a pencil, it's almost part of your body and part of consciousness. So I think these people, though, that we've discussed today really laid the foundation for machine learning, which is very different. And that has resulted in AI, which is an incredibly human-looking thing, if not human in its capabilities. And I'd put it this way. A lot of people talk about these unique skills that we need for it used to be called 21st century skills, which are critical thinking, creativity, we discussed a little bit today, collaboration, communication, problem solving, and so on. Now, actually, I think with AI, what these people have brought together is this may be completely misguided. When I'm looking at Turing, I think he would have laughed at this a little bit, because take them one back. Take creativity. I think we create with AI these days, and I think we use AI to be a critical friend and critique things we're doing and critique the world.
And a thought partner.
I think, funnily enough, it's not that I am the subject and AI is an object out there in the world and we need to tame it, control it, and manipulate it. It's actually part of our cognitive architecture now. And I like the word commune. I think we commune with AI in that sense. We create with it. We're critical with it. It's certainly massively collaborative because it's the sum total of all collaborative human culture. It's the most collaborative thing you can imagine. When you're speaking to an AI large language model, you're speaking to the collective us. You're speaking to us. It's the single greatest act of productive collaboration in the history of the species in that sense. And I think when you get agents, you then have another form of collaboration where we'll be collaborating with AI agents to do things, and maybe collaborating with each other. And then even on communications, you got this wonderful form of dialogue with AI, which is unique in technology.
Yeah.
Where you really are speaking with it, not speaking at it. It's now dialogue. You're speaking with it. I was looking at a project last week, a company called Riser, who are doing training for doctors on how you speak to patients. And so I'm a doctor, can go into this thing and speak to it, and it will behave like a patient. Not only that, it will give me critical skills because it critiques my dealings of the patient against the set of standards that doctors need when they speak to patients.
Yeah, so AI coach, really.
Yes, it's actually an AI, a super form of assessment in a way. It's like an invigilator. It will it could teach you how to be better because they have these standards. They know what makes a good consultation with the patient. There are about 8 major standards there, and it can judge you on each of the 8, which a human being finds very difficult to do in practice. But the machine does it superbly well and records everything. It's exact. It has absolute attention. So I think we should sort of ditch that notion that we have these exceptional human skills, all beginning with the letter C. That's a cocktail of C words, and that we should reflect on that a little bit and use another C word, and that's see AI as part of our cognitive makeup, part of learning, part of teaching, in a sort of nexus, as it were. And that's the way forward, not to have this binary split between it and us. Yeah. It is us in a way. And I think communing with it is the way forward, really.
So we need to commune with AI, so we're AI communists.
Yes. Very good job.
Maybe we should stop there.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Donald. That's been great. I forgot how much stamina it took to do these long episodes, thinking so hard, but also how much fun they are and how much I feel I've learned at the end of that. Thanks a lot.
It's great to be back doing Series 7, is it, I think? And
Series 7, yeah.
Yeah, it's such fun doing these things, I feel as though when I'm speaking, I'm learning a lot myself, like it's forcing me to think a lot about these things. So I'm sure you feel the same. It's fantastic. And hopefully people out there get a similar experience. So that's great.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. We'd also like to extend a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors for this season.